In this week's video, I'll be unboxing and assembling my brand new Rohde HMT 600 potter's wheel and finally throwing a few porcelain pots on it. For those of you who might not know, and I prefer to be transparent about things like this, Rohde and I have had a working relationship ever since I set up my workshop. They gave me a sizable discount on my gas kiln, electric kiln and my first wheel. I was even flown out to see my gas kiln being built. I only wish I had been making YouTube videos back then, as I would have loved to have filmed the process of the kiln being welded together. Since then, this relationship has continued, so whilst I'm certainly not paid to talk about and use their equipment, they do every now and then send me something for free, such as this Rohde HMT 600, which they've only recently released, which means this video is an advert of sorts, but it'll be a useful one I hope, and I'll go over in great detail about how I set it up and what I think about it too. I just wanted to get all of that out of the way first. So, not only does this come with a wheel, but it has a new built-on shelf and a stool that attaches to the wheel too. Wheels are quite heavy objects, and within the potter's world they're famously the things that injure potters' backs when they try to lift them up by themselves, which is why I only pushed or dragged it to get it inside the studio, as the wheel itself, the motor, and the chassis around it, all in all, weighs about 40 kilograms. I've been needing a new wheel, so I've been wanting to set up a permanent porcelain workstation, which means I won't have to constantly clean up whenever I switch between the high iron stoneware clay body I use and the perfectly white, pristine porcelain, which is so easily stained, and once it is, there's virtually no going back. So I hope having a dedicated workspace just for this type of clay will mean I can make with it more easily without having to give my old wheel a really thorough, deep clean every time I switch. Before I begin properly assembling it, I gave the spot where it'll go a good wash, and as I didn't feel like lifting this out of the box by myself, I just cut down these two sides so it could easily be dragged out. Rohde's wheels, like many old school Alsagers and Ratcliffes, has a hose that leads off from the splash tray, which I usually just direct straight into a bucket of reclaim. It's a small thing really, but it makes tidying up just that much easier. And as potters, anything that makes tidying up more straightforward is very, very welcome. The next package contains the shelf. This fastens onto the wheel chassis, creating a platform on which you can place your water, your mirror, and all your tools. Previously, I've always built them myself, such as this one I made for my old Rohde HMT 500, which works, but it isn't perfect. It easily comes loose and has warped a tiny bit, so having something that's a bit more proper will be a very nice thing. I also asked Rohde to make my shelf not as tall as they usually come, mainly as I still want to be able to film without this prefabricated shelf blocking the view. It normally sits 21 centimeters above the wheel chassis, but mine sits just 11 centimeters above it, which is also just more in line with what I'm used to. It's certainly far more solid compared to those I've built in the past myself. Alongside the wooden portion of the shelf are the metal components, the struts, that'll hold the shelf up, which are also painted in Rohde's customary cyan colour, like all their products are. And in this next box is the wheel seat, which has been completely redesigned compared to the last iteration that was wooden. Instead, this one has a padded seat and apparently interlocks into the wheel itself a bit more easily. The seats on wheels are important things. After all, they're likely something you'll spend hundreds, if not thousands of hours sat upon. I certainly have. And in the past, when I've thrown on a particularly uncomfortable wheel, I've had to tape foam to the seat, or even just chuck a pillow onto it, in order to survive long days of throwing. But this was easy enough to assemble. The hydraulic section just pops into the metal stand, and the seat goes onto that. And having a seat that's so easily adjustable will come in really handy when making bigger pots. It's comfy, although I'll need to spend a full day throwing on it before I can give you a proper report. Next, as the wheel does feel a bit too low for me, I'll unscrew each of the legs and raise the entire thing by about 10 centimeters or so, which feels good for my height. In hindsight, I should have started with one of the back legs, but having a screwing mechanism like this definitely makes it easier to adjust as compared to the last model. The floor in my studio is anything but level, and so with my other wheel, I ended up propping up one of the legs just with 2 throwing bats, but with this new wheel it can all be adjusted via the legs themselves. With the wheel now propped up to a better height, I'll now fasten the shelf onto the back of it. First things first, these 2 screws need to be removed. And it's worth noting here that both the shelf and the seat are additional add-ons. It doesn't need them to function, so if you already have a comfy stool or want to build your own table, you can still do that. Next, I took each of the threaded rods and screwed them in a bit. I then measured each so that about 11 centimeters of the rod remained protruding upwards. I then placed the washers and the struts over them, which all slotted in very neatly, and then placed the shelf over them. I then placed 2 nuts into these holes which screw onto the threaded rod, and finally I tightened them both, which pulled and tightened it all together. With that done, I dragged the wheel into place next to my trestle table and my other wheel. It always feels a bit strange when a brand new piece of sparkling equipment enters the workshop. It stands out like a sore thumb compared to everything else that has a fine layer of dust over it. I then took the stool and slotted one of the wheel's legs onto it, and then I adjusted it to more or less what felt right. With the wheel in place, I can finally move on to attaching the pedal and the power cord. Now, there's a reason I like the pedals of the Rohde wheels so much, which you can see clearly by the Yamaha logo on the bottom left of the box. I've used a lot of pedals in my time as a potter, and this is by and far the most comfortable and responsive one I've ever used. Equally, the pivot point is right down near the base of the pedal, which makes pushing it up and down feel so easy, and compared to other wheels, where the pivot point is higher up, it just feels so much more natural to use. They also don't tend to seize up quite so much, but perhaps I just haven't got mine messy enough yet. Either way, I trust the brand that produces pedals for instruments and motorcycles, and it simply plugs straight into the bottom, like this. The last piece of the puzzle is the power cord. It plugs in right next to the pedal, which I then plug into an extension cord nearby. And then, just to minimise how much wire there is spreading across the floor, I carefully wrap them up and tie the bundles together with old wire ties previously used for bags of clay. I then just tie this bundle around one of the struts, just to keep it off the floor. I do the same with the pedal too, bundling up much of the wire and tying it into a neat bunch. And with that, the wheel is now totally assembled and ready to be used, which I almost don't want to do, as the wheel's so clean at this point and there's no going back. So the wheel is switched on, and the wheel is set to spin in the correct orientation, which in the Western world tends to be anti-clockwise, and in places like Japan and China, you'll find them working with the wheel spinning in the opposite direction. There's even a handy magnetic holder onto which all the wheel-specific Allen keys can be attached, and the extra screws too. And again, this is a very simple feature, but one I really like, as previously I pretty much always lose all of these bits, but maybe that just reflects me more than anything else. So here it is, the old, next to it my newly assembled Rohde HMT 600. I'll find a bucket to stick underneath the hose, and onto the shelf I can place my throwing mirror, pots of tools, and stacks of bats, which slot quite neatly into this corner, and I will attach my throwing gauge on the left hand side eventually. The mirror isn't for looking at myself in, rather it's there so that with a single glance I can easily see the side view of the pot I'm making. So as I'm throwing or trimming I can look down, or I can just glance up, and in the mirror I can see a much better view of the pot. Without a mirror, to see the side of the pot I'd have to awkwardly lean backwards like this, which is uncomfortable, especially if you're production throwing and making hundreds of pots, and leaning back awkwardly all throughout the day. I know I've probably talked about using a mirror a lot in my videos, but I really can't recommend it enough. And when making without it, I feel as if I'm missing an additional sense. It's just so useful. And now with the wheel set up, I'll prepare some porcelain clay to throw with. After all, This will now be my permanent porcelain workstation. So thank you Rohde for sending me this, and I hope for the rest of you it was interesting to see the wheel being put together. This porcelain I'm using has been sitting wrapped up tightly for months now, which meant that its outside surface was really quite firm, but on the inside it was relatively soft, so it just needed a quick wedge to really mix both portions and leave me with a clay body that's entirely smooth and even in texture, and void too of any small air pockets inside. Once fully wedged up, I change the position of my hands and carefully roll the spiral up, making sure I don't trap any additional air inside. I then sliced off and weighed out lumps of about 1.5 pounds, which is 680 grams. Nothing huge, and more than anything I just wanted to test out the new wheel. After the porcelain was weighed out, I then wedged up each lump individually again, kneading them into a shape which has a pointed top and a rounded bottom. The curved base helps, as it simply stops air from being trapped underneath it as the lump of clay is slammed onto the wheel. Comparatively, this clay feels so different from the usual stoneware I use. It's incredibly smooth, and it feels slightly less plastic, as if it's not quite as responsive when moved around. As a clay body, porcelain is notoriously difficult to work with, and it likes to warp, crack, split, and generally punish you for any shoddy craftsmanship. So it does need to be thrown in a slightly different way. It needs to be compressed more, coned up and down more, and compared with the slightly crogged stoneware body you normally see on my channel, there are ways I'd throw that I'd never dream of throwing porcelain. For instance, with the stoneware clay, I can just open up the base and leave it quickly finished, whereas with porcelain, now this lump has been opened up, I'll very carefully run my fingers back and forth, not necessarily pushing down any further, but simply compressing the clay, and if you don't do this with porcelain, there's a good chance the base might crack as it dries or when you fire it, so it's much better being safe than sorry. Another reason for being more careful when working with porcelain is that it tends to be considerably more expensive than stoneware clay bodies. It can be more than double the price, so ideally you don't want all your carefully made pots to crack, especially during the firing stage, as once being put through the kiln, there's no way of recycling the material. And now with the porcelain centered, I can begin to pull up the walls. And when working with porcelain, I tend to use a soaked sponge on the outside, as opposed to my knuckle, and when I do throw, I try to use water that contains quite a lot of slip, as it tends to cling to the walls of the pot better. I don't try and get much height in the first pull, rather I just thin out what was quite a thick expanse of clay, and it's in the second and third pulls that I really pinch at the bottom and drag up much more material. And I have to say, in terms of the wheel so far, the new seat is really comfortable. I was a little bit concerned as well by the size of the wheel tray in photographs I had seen, as some wheels have trays that are so small that you can barely fit your hand into them, which makes cleaning them out really difficult. But this one's perfect, and it feels nice and sturdy, especially when I'm centering the clay and really bracing my arms on the plastic splash tray. For this initial test run, I'm just going to throw a few porcelain vases. Angular in nature, they always start off as being quite curvaceous forms, which I then section off into their more distinct planes. The spinning wheel isn't completely silent, but it's quiet enough, especially compared to some I've used in the past that almost sound like a helicopter. This motor just produces a quiet whirring noise, which I more or less phase out. I only ever really make pots in silence when I'm filming videos for YouTube or my Instagram. Otherwise I'm pretty much always listening to an audiobook, music, or a podcast. The shape I'm throwing will have a narrow base, a bellied out midsection, and an opening that tapers back in to a fine rim, which I can work to a much finer edge than my stoneware would ever allow. This is because the slightly coarse stoneware I use contains thousands of small specks of already fired clay. Such inclusions make the clay stronger at this point. It also means it will shrink less, and it also helps the clay from cracking as it dries. Although having that fine grog does mean that I can only ever finish the rims of my pots to such a fine degree before the specks themselves overwhelm the lip and almost become more prominent than the clay itself. Whereas with porcelain, as it's so smooth, the edges of the pots can be thrown and trimmed to razor sharp points, whilst remaining relatively durable in a way that high iron, production fired pots simply won't be. Porcelain is an exceedingly strong clay, and it's why you see it used so much in certain industries. The other lovely quality about it is that when thrown and trimmed relatively thinly, it almost acts like glass, and if I held this pot up to the light, I'd see silhouettes of my fingers through the thin walls. Once the belly has been roughly pushed out, I'll begin collaring in the top. I do this bit by bit, and between collars, I'll throw this waist section and the shoulder inwards. To do this on the top, I push my index finger quite aggressively into the clay, whilst the finger on my left hand stays underneath the wall, supporting it and hopefully preventing it from flopping inwards. At this point I realised the pot needed to be a bit more rotund, so I took my throwing stick, wetted its end, and carefully pushed the walls out from the inside. Now the shape is more or less there, I'll scrape away some of the excess porcelain from around the base, which if not too saturated and slippy, I'll take the scraps and immediately set them off to one side, so I can quickly wedge it back into the porcelain on my workbench. I then position the straight, sharp edge of my throwing kidney just so it rests on the wall, and then from the inside, I use my fingertips just to push out slightly, running them up against the metal edge, whilst the wall of porcelain, of course, remains in between. This scrapes away much of the excess slip that lines the walls, refining the shape and making a pot that will dry out more quickly, as it isn't covered in a layer of fine slurry. I also find that porcelain tends to dry out far more quickly to leather hard compared to the stoneware clays I use, although this doesn't mean you should dry it out quickly, as if you aren't careful and you're rushing the drying process, that's when pots can really crack, especially if you're using something like porcelain that's just that bit more prone to doing so. And with the vase thrown and the rim delicately finished, I slide a wire beneath the pot which separates it from the wheel, and then it can very carefully be clasped with dry hands and lifted away. All in all, I found the wheel a joy to use. The pedal is responsive and easy to push down. You can even push down and remove your foot. That way the wheel keeps spinning without your foot having to remain in place. The splash tray is a usable size and it's easy to clean up, and generally it doesn't feel all too different as compared to the previous wheel, apart from a few new functional changes, like the shelf, the improved seat which slots in place easily on the wheel, and the more rounded splash tray which just feels right. Ultimately, I'm not quite sure what else there really is you can improve upon, and I suppose that's why wheels have remained more or less the same for thousands of years. They're simple objects at heart, and really it's what you do on them and how you use them which makes all the difference. But I'm so happy to have this addition, as hopefully it makes working with porcelain just feel that bit more seamless, although I am now questioning whether I should get an entirely new set of tools, which I only use for porcelain, but maybe that's taking it too far. So once again, thank you Rohde for the glorious gift. I'll leave a link down in the description below to it, although I think you have to find a local supplier, and I'm not sure whether Rohde sell in the United States yet. They're a family-run business, and maybe sometime in the future I'll get the chance to head back to the factory to film and show you some of that process too, but who knows. Thanks, as always, for watching. And I feel I should mention this, but if there's ever a topic or a particular shape you want to see thrown and the process described, then do let me know, as I'm always open to suggestions. And, as always, I'll see you next week.